You found your way to Whispers of Crimes, a quiet corner where the shadows of the past are gently told. Here, we speak of real crimes and mysteries, not to shock or scare, but to wonder, to reflect, and maybe to help you fall asleep. So close your eyes, let your thoughts slow down, and come with me into tonight's case. In the heart of Lahore, a chilling confession surfaced, a letter, cold and calculated, from a man who claimed to have murdered hundreds. He said his victims were children, innocent, desperate souls. But as the world read his words, something didn't sit right. The police, initially skeptical, didn't know what they were about to uncover in the house of this quiet man, a man who had lived among them for years, undetected. He had promised them the truth. But the truth, it seemed, was far worse than anyone could have imagined. Cut to dark, suspenseful music. And then he disappeared. With the authorities closing in, Javed Iqbal vanished without a trace. How could a man who had confessed to the world's most horrific crimes simply slip away? Did he really escape? Or was there something even darker at play? The case would eventually go to trial, but the answers they were seeking, were they ever truly found? And in the end, who really controls the story when the one telling it is already gone? What happened to the monster of Lahore? And who, if anyone, will ever uncover the truth? Stay tuned, the mystery isn't over yet. Chapter 1, A Letter of Confession. It was December 1999 when a handwritten letter, a chilling confession, arrived at the office of an Urdu language newspaper in Lahore. The letter, signed by Javed Iqbal, read like something straight out of a nightmare. Iqbal claimed to have murdered 100 boys, children who ranged in age from as young as 6 to 16 years old. His words were disturbingly calm, almost detached. He didn't express remorse or guilt. Instead, he seemed to be recounting a methodical, calculated plan, a mission completed with precision. In the letter, Iqbal included names, ages, even photographs of some of the victims. He also included a specific chilling detail. He directed the authorities to his home, where they would find irrefutable evidence of his horrific crimes. The tone of the letter was confident, almost boastful, as if he had orchestrated a great work and now wanted the world to acknowledge it. The fact that a man could write about the brutal murders of children with such coldness sent waves of shock through the city. The police were skeptical at first. They couldn't believe that someone would be so brazen in confessing to such unimaginable horrors. But as they analyzed the letter more closely, the details seemed too specific to ignore. It was a taunt, not a hoax. Iqbal promised that they would find corroborating evidence in his home that would confirm his sickening tale. Reluctantly, law enforcement began to mobilize, unsure of what they would find, but fully aware of the stakes involved. What awaited them in Shadbagh, the neighborhood where Iqbal's house stood, would soon prove to be a nightmare beyond anything they could have prepared for. Chapter 2, The House of Horror. Javed Iqbal's house was unremarkable from the outside. It blended in with the other homes in the neighborhood, modest, perhaps a bit run down, but nothing extraordinary. The horror, however, began the moment the police entered. The air was thick with the smell of chemicals. The officers knew they were on the verge of discovering something grotesque, but they could never have anticipated the extent of what they would find. In the dim light of the house, hidden away in a back room, were 2 large vats, each filled with a corrosive solution of hydrochloric acid. These vats were the final resting places of many of Iqbal's victims. The acid had completely dissolved their bodies, leaving behind only bone fragments and some charred, indistinct remains. Police scoured the house further and found items belonging to children's school uniforms, backpacks, shoes, and toys, familiar, innocuous things that belonged to the lives Iqbal had stolen. There were photographs of young boys, some in varying states of undress, posed in ways that spoke of violence and exploitation. These were not just images of innocence. They were the final mementos of lives brutally taken. But the most chilling discovery was Iqbal's diary, a personal account of his horrifying spree. Each entry detailed how he lured his victims, often with the promise of shelter, food, or work. His writing was disturbingly detached. He meticulously described the methods he used to kill. He would drug his victims, strangle them, sometimes sexually abuse them before death, and then finally dissolve their bodies in acid to erase any trace of their existence. But the most terrifying aspect was his reasoning. Iqbal did not kill for greed or revenge. He killed because he felt the world had wronged him, and he wanted to make the world feel his pain. Javed Iqbal did not seem to care about the lives he ended. He only cared about the message he believed he was sending. Chapter 3: The Ghost Among the Crowds. After the discovery of the house and the damning evidence, police immediately launched a massive manhunt to capture Iqbal. Yet, despite the urgency, he was nowhere to be found. Iqbal had vanished without a trace, blending into the dense, bustling streets of Lahore like a shadow. No one knew where he was or who he could be hiding with. This wasn't a random disappearance. Javed Iqbal was smart. He had planned this for months, if not years. He had built his life around deception. For years, he had presented himself as a philanthropist, someone who cared about the welfare of children, especially the poor, homeless, and orphaned. He ran a youth shelter that provided food and shelter to street children. But behind the facade of benevolence was a predator, someone who carefully crafted his image to gain the trust of the very children he would later target. For those who knew him, Javed Iqbal seemed to be an ordinary man, even charismatic in some ways. He was well-spoken, well-dressed, and used his wealth and connections to blend in with high society. His public image was that of a man who cared deeply for the less fortunate. Yet, as the police dug deeper into his past, they discovered a darker, more disturbing side to his personality. He was a man who could lie with ease, who could manipulate those around him without a second thought. Despite the police's best efforts, Iqbal proved elusive. The manhunt stretched on for days, then weeks, with no sign of the killer. But his pride, it seemed, would eventually catch up with him. He had always intended to be found, not immediately, but eventually. His actions had been calculated, and his confession had been part of his twisted plan to gain notoriety. The final step in his scheme was yet to come. On December 30th, 1999, Javed Iqbal walked calmly into the office of a major newspaper in Lahore without fear or hesitation. He confessed that he was the man behind the killings and gave himself up. Offering no further resistance, the nation was stunned. A man who had eluded capture for so long had simply walked into the open, like a man who had already won. Iqbal's surrender would mark the beginning of a new chapter in this gruesome tale, but it also raised more questions. Why would a man who had gone to such great lengths to avoid capture suddenly turn himself in? And what did he hope to achieve by doing so? Chapter 4: Surrender in Silence. Javed Iqbal's surrender was a shock to everyone. The man who had been the subject of one of the largest manhunts in Pakistan's history had finally decided to give himself up, but not out of remorse. His motives, as always, seemed more calculated. Iqbal told reporters that he feared for the safety of his family. According to him, police had detained his mother and brother and allegedly subjected them to brutal treatment to extract information about his whereabouts. But there was something unsettling about his confession. His calm demeanor in the face of such heinous crimes, his lack of any real emotion, led many to believe that his surrender was part of a larger, more manipulative game. Iqbal seemed more interested in maintaining control of the narrative, rather than expressing any genuine regret for the lives he had taken. Even in his public statements, he was composed, almost proud of the horrors he had unleashed. He didn't express sorrow or fear. He seemed more focused on explaining the details of his crimes, as though he were a man explaining a carefully executed plan. The police were quick to take him into custody, but his interrogation, like everything else about him, was methodical. He recounted his murders in chilling detail, speaking about how he had chosen his victims, mostly street children, orphans, and those with no one to care for them. He explained how he would lure them into his home, giving them food or the promise of a better life. Then, once they were inside, he would drug them, strangle them, and carry out the rest of his ritual. There was no rush, no frenzy. Everything was carried out with disturbing calmness and precision. His cold indifference was deeply unsettling to those who questioned him. He showed no fear of the consequences, no regret for his actions. It was as if the deaths of these children meant nothing to him at all. When asked how he could live with himself, he responded with chilling simplicity, "I never plan to live forever." Chapter 5. The Trial of a Monster. As the months passed and the trial of Javed Iqbal began, the entire nation of Pakistan was riveted by the case. It was not only the brutality of the crimes that shocked the public, but the sheer audacity of Iqbal's actions. Here was a man who had not only killed with impunity, but had boasted about it, even providing the authorities with the means to track him down. It seemed impossible to understand how someone could be so cold, so detached from humanity. The trial, which began in early 2000, was highly publicized. The courtroom was filled with journalists, families of the victims, and even law enforcement officers. Iqbal was not only charged with the murder of 100 children, but also with the abuse and exploitation of his victims before their deaths. The testimonies of the families of the children were heartbreaking. They spoke of their children as innocent, hopeful souls boys who had been lured into Iqbal's clutches under the guise of compassion, only to be murdered in the most brutal way imaginable. Despite the overwhelming evidence, the trial proceeded slowly. Iqbal's defense attorneys attempted to argue that he was insane, that he had been driven to murder by his past traumas. But no one in the courtroom was fooled. Iqbal had planned his actions with too much precision to be seen as anything but a cold, calculating killer. As the trial drew to a close, the judge delivered his verdict. It was a death sentence, but not just any death sentence. Iqbal was to be executed in the same way he had killed his victims, strangled, then dismembered, and finally dissolved in acid. The families of the victims would be present to witness his final moments. For many, this was not just justice, it was revenge. But there was one final, shocking twist in this case that no one could have predicted. Chapter 6. A Death Shrouded in Mystery. Javed Iqbal never lived to see the execution. On October 8, 2001, his body was found hanging in his prison cell, a victim of an apparent suicide. Along with him was another young accomplice, also found dead under similar circumstances. Officially, the authorities declared it a double suicide. They claimed that the two men had taken their own lives during the night, but many people were not convinced. There were whispers that Iqbal had been murdered, possibly by other inmates seeking revenge, or even by corrupt prison officials. Some believed that the authorities, wanting to avoid a media spectacle or further public outcry, had silenced Iqbal before he could face the execution. To this day, the true circumstances of his death remain unclear. What is certain is that Javed Iqbal, despite his earlier boasts of bringing the truth to light, was denied the death he had been sentenced to. Whether it was fate, the vengeance of those he had harmed, or a cold act of justice, Iqbal was gone. Chapter 7. The Shadows Left Behind. Javed Iqbal's legacy is one of unspeakable horror. His crime shook Pakistan to its core, but his death, whether by his own hand or at the hands of others, did not provide the closure so many were hoping for. The families of the children he murdered were left with nothing but grief. and a sense of injustice that would never be fully addressed. Iqbal's murders were not random acts of violence. They were a direct result of societal neglect, the systematic failure to protect the most vulnerable members of society, the street children, orphans, and the forgotten. He preyed on the marginalized, those who no one cared about. His crimes brought attention to the plight of these children, but for many, it was a tragic wake-up call that arrived far too late. In the aftermath, there were calls for reform. Shelters for street children were re-examined. Laws surrounding the protection of minors were tightened. But as with so many tragedies, the momentum faded, and the deep-rooted issues that allowed someone like Iqbal to act with such impunity were never fully addressed. The question remains, how could one man commit such horrors? The answer is chillingly simple. He was allowed to. Javed Iqbal's monstrous actions were made possible by a society that refused to see its most vulnerable members as worthy of protection. His story, for all its grotesque details, is a reminder of what happens when we turn a blind eye to the suffering of the powerless. And in that darkness, the name Javed Iqbal lives on not just as a killer, but as a reflection of the failings of a society that allowed him to become the monster he was. That's all for tonight's story. Another thread in the web of true crime, quietly unraveling as the night goes on. If you're still with me, thanks for listening. And if sleep has already taken you, may your dreams be peaceful and your mind at ease. I'll be here next time by the fire with another story waiting to be told. Good night, and don't forget to lock your doors.